Welcome back, everybody. So in this video, that's probably going to be the main one within this sort of series. We're going to look at a actual pre-registration, and we're just going to look a little bit about how we can do that on the Open Science Framework itself. So in a previous video, we toured a project page within the Open Science Framework. What I have here is one for a project of mine that is currently not registered. It's some data is there, but it's not a pre-registered study. Or we can treat this as a case where we've set up the project and we want to create a pre-registration, for example. So we can hit pre-registrations, and that's going to bring up a box for us asking the question of, here we go, very occasionally the Open Science Framework can take a second to run. It's nothing to worry about, it's just because it's a complex platform that does a lot of work. Okay. Now on this registrations page, if we had already completed a registration form, we'd see it now. May remember in the previous video that you could see an open registration that was just the timestamped document for when it was submitted, as opposed to it being a kind of analysis plan registration. So from here we can hit new registration, and that's going to give us a number of options that are built into the Open Science Framework. So this first list appeared in the previous video, different templates that we can look into. Now, each one gives you some information if you hover over the little information button. The OSF Preregistration is probably the most extensive, which is the one that we'll go through just now. Now when we click create draft, that's going to create us a draft one. Now it's only actually turn into the timestamped kind of registered version when you actually hit register at the end. So for now it's just going to be a draft. Now this particular version, as you can see down the side, is split up into the more metadata stuff, the study information, the design plan, the sampling plan, the variables of interest, the analysis plan, some other questions, and then you can review it. Now within this, there might be some questions that for your particular study are either repetitive or may not be applicable. If that's the case, you can just put in not applicable. That's fine. I view this form as more of a useful tool for the questions that I might want to ask, and the sort of questions that I might want to go into. Another useful resource for this that I linked to in the previous video is the registered reports page. It also includes not only the Q&As but also a resource put together by Chris Chambers entitled 10 questions to ask for a successful stage 1 submission or similar. And they are exceedingly useful questions to ask before you start collecting data, or ideally, sometimes after you, or at the very least before you start analysing anything in terms of the way that you want to go about the work. So there's a number of sections. We won't look at the metadata because that's not too important for our purposes just now. Now, the form will ask for your hypotheses. It will ask you to include design plans that may or may not be as relevant. Your particular design might be outside of the ones that are offered here, and again, that's fine. If for whatever reason your design is so far away from what's possible within a Open Science Framework pre-registration template, then it might be worth considering the kinds of questions and working through your own. Okay, now would be a good time for us to look at an existing pre-registration. So I picked this one mostly at random as being a completed one that we can look at just to get a rough idea of what may or may not go into a pre-registration form like this. Now, one of the useful things with this one that we can immediately see is that the research questions are very clearly defined. They're clearly delineated into the individual questions. They are separated into the primary and the secondary questions, all very useful things. And as we'll see later on, each question also links to a specific hypothesis, which itself links to a specific statistical test. Now again, this, to my mind, goes beyond the typical transparency, openness, even the fooling ourselves aspect, but it also forces us to think, before we've done any analysis, how exactly we're going to try and address our hypothesis with the data that we have using a particular analysis. Sometimes, as I've had lots of discussions along these lines, the particular hypotheses can be either too vague or might be too complicated. And in those cases, using this approach is a really quick way to realize that actually what sounds like a simple hypothesis, when we sort of think about it, might actually still require many, many steps of analyses to support and to eliminate alternative hypotheses and to ensure that we're controlling for the right factors, for example. So these authors have nicely set out each of their primary questions. So do adults with ADHD report higher levels of overall HF, which is defined as hyperfocus above, than neurotypical adults? And they break out into a number of secondary questions. Again, as I mentioned, in the hypotheses, they also nicely link each of these research questions to a specific hypothesis. One of the nice things about having a specific hypothesis and writing it down beforehand is that using directional tests is a bit more applicable. And it doesn't come across as a cheeky way to make your p-value smaller and cross that magic 0.05 threshold. Okay, so we will also see the sampling plan. Now this asks if the pre-registration refers to data that's going to be collected or that has already been collected. Again, you can pre-register analyses on data that already exists. There are some limitations in that, for example, if the data has been published elsewhere, then in theory you already know what some of the associations are going to be, and that might bias some of your expectations. So you do have more prior knowledge, but at the same time you can still reduce some of those researcher degrees of freedom and increase the rigor of the work. Okay. Now, at the same time, we go into detail about the data collection procedure itself. So in this case, the authors have quite nicely described the sample that they'll be recruiting, how much the sample will be compensated for the research itself, the way that they're going to define participants as having or not having a diagnosis on their scale, how they're going to recontact participants with randomly selected sample from the first part, and all of these useful aspects. In theory, after finishing this pre-registration, you will have all of the information that should go into your method and your data analysis section, as well as potentially several sections from your introductory section of a paper. It's also very possible that you'll have already done a lot more planning and included a lot more information than is included in the vast majority of method sections, but that's good. The science research is in the method. It's in the process of what we do, not only in the results that we try and interpret. Okay, sample size. Now, sample size is something that gets a lot of people within research. It can be a very difficult aspect depending on the design that you have. Again, one useful aspect of pre-registration is that it forces you to really think about the effect size that you're interested in, the sample that you need to be able to detect that effect size, or to have a certain level of precision within your estimation, for example, just as two ways of looking at the data. It also means that you can decide on this before you've started to collect the data, rather than looking back at a research project and having the very undergraduate report, we needed more people. It allows you to actually think about that a lot more beforehand. An awful lot of journals, in terms of registered reports, almost as standard, they will require some kind of power analysis or a strong justification for the sample size. It's possible to justify your sample size in a number of ways. So it could be based on previous literature and the smallest effect size of interest that you're interested in. It could be based on resource. It is possible to say we have this many resources to recruit this many participants. Now, what that won't do is increase your power above the sample size that you've already collected, but it is a rationale. It is a way of saying why you've chosen the sample size that you've chosen. Again, transparently, openly, and much more rigorously than a cell size of 20, for example. Once again, this is more difficult for things like secondary data analysis, for example. In those cases, you can still run kinds of power analyses, for example, that will give you some indication of the kinds of effects that you'll be able to observe, and possibly even the complexity of the analysis that you're going to run. It's always useful to think about these questions and to know, even before you've analysed the data, whether there's even a chance that you might be able to ask the question that you're interested in. Okay, it's a lot about sample size. So we can see here that the authors use G-power. They set power to 80%, and they used an alpha of 0.01. I assume to correct for multiple testing in some way. It's awfully useful, and as you can see, they based the power analysis on a previous pilot test. Something that's really useful for pre-registration is utilizing previous research, previous pilots, to be able to inform the design. There are some limitations in pilot studies, especially very, very small ones, to run power calculations. But that's a more complicated issue than we have time to go into. Suffice to say that pilot data can be useful, and using it to justify your sample size can again be a valuable tool. You may want to specify a stopping rule. Now that could be, once you've reached so many participants, it might be that you can only run data collection for so many months, for example. All of these kind of things can be involved, but again, the important thing is just specifying that. Now, variables this might be one of the drier sections of a pre-registration, but the important thing is noting the variables that are of the core interest, that might relate to the primary, the secondary outcomes, the specific hypotheses. It's a good place to be able to say, we also collected this data from this measure, but it wasn't our main analyses. And again, this will help you distinguish between your core analyses, your confirmatory analyses, and any exploratory analyses that you also decide to run. Okay. So here we can see that they have ADHD questions, they have overall scores and subscale scores for the primary measures. You also see how they've listed off the secondary outcome variables of interest. These also link quite nicely to the hypotheses that's specified earlier, and having that continuation between is useful for other people to understand as well. You can see in this case, you can also add documents to your pre-registration. You can see here they've actually added the questionnaires, again, useful. It comes into our open materials conversation in a previous video, but these are useful things. It's immensely frustrating to not know which measures were used in a study, or to not be able to find the items for a particular very popular measure to use in one's own study. Okay. Now, indices here is an interesting one, where the authors have very explicitly stated how they're calculating their measures of interest. Now, this is also important for those of you that have read papers that don't clearly describe, for example, how a measure was calculated, whether it was a simple sum score, whether it was taking the mean, whether items are reverse scored, whether there's subscales, all of these kind of things. Having all of that specified is very, very useful. And again, specifying it here makes it much easier to turn it into code and to actually then run the analysis at a later date. Okay, so the indices are all much for muchness. Many of these are sum scores, so we won't go into that too much. Okay, and you can also include things like references for the measures that you include, so that you include as much information as possible. Again, in a way, this particular form is very much like a broken down method section, but split into specific sections. It's useful. In the design plan, there's questions about the study type. So in this case, it's an observational study. There's also experimental with different kind of branches. I think there's RCT as well. They have items about whether there's blinding, how that blinding is enacted, and you'd be required to put in some information about that. And the study design in terms of the within, the between design and the levels of each of those factors. It also asks you to input any information about randomization, which is again useful. These forms, many of them were initially developed for more experimental research. So in some designs, maybe more observational or just different research areas. Some questions, again, may or may not be, they may be more or less applicable to your design. But again, a lot of them are useful to think about. Now, the analysis plan. The analysis plan to me is a big part of this. It's probably the aspect that people think of as being the first bit, rather than thinking about the things like calculating the outcome measures. Okay, so again, a really useful thing that the authors have done here that I would suggest anybody do in written papers, whether they're pre-registrations or not, but particularly in pre-registrations, is to link your hypotheses and your research questions to the measures and to the models. So this model here corresponds to the hypothesis above. So in this case, so this is describing their ANOVA design as almost as linear regression written out as. Of course, they are the same thing. And again, this is such a useful aspect of the analysis plan because it forces you to specify exactly what's going into it. For example, what we often see in published research is a lack of clarity in terms of, for example, if additional covariates or control variables were put into the analyses, for example, to control for age, gender, socioeconomic status, and so on. And what specifying your model does is makes that explicit from the start. So any changes here, again, are really useful to see because they make it clear whether it was a pre-specified plan or whether it was more of an exploratory analysis to also control for example, gender and age. Okay. Now, included in statistical models are things like transformations, if the data is going to be transformed in any way. The authors here have laid out their follow-up analyses based on the hypotheses linked above. So they have the 1 to 7 here. They make a specific part of the pre-registration about any thresholds for inference. So this could be a p-value, it could be a Bayes factor, it could be a level of precision, it could be any decision criteria. There's also a section for data exclusion and missing data. Again, how the authors plan to deal with these. And finally, an exploratory analysis to cover analyses that haven't been fully planned but might be done. Now, if you're super organized, you might also be able to include a script at this point. So if you've simulated data or you have a dummy data set, for example, maybe even one from a previous study if you're running a replication, then you could also include the script that you're going to use. Now again, that would mean that when you've collected your data, you can load the data and click go, get your results. And suddenly the data analysis stage that would normally take weeks into months is done in a day. Now there's other aspects that could be included in this that we haven't had too much time to touch on in this workshop. It might be the case that there are almost a decision tree that could come out in the pre-registration. So for example, if the data meet these assumptions, then we will run these analyses. If this particular assumption is broken, then we will run a robust version of the analysis. Is a really basic example. There could be many more kind of complicated versions, but that's one way to account for potential things that could come up that would change the analysis that you need to run. So that is a completed pre-registration. In the previous video, I noted that I might cut that.